What if Disclosure were a D-Beat band? This week I'll be learning a little more about an electronic duo who burst onto the scene in 2010 and 16 years later are still headlining festivals. And I'll also be celebrating D-Beat, the stark, grimy form of punk gifted to the world by Stoke's legendary hardcore pioneers Discharge. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays follow up with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What Ifs is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the house in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was White Noise by Disclosure featuring Aluna George, and I tried to reimagine that as a D-Beat punk song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, I'll be the first to admit I don't know a great deal about Disclosure. The reason I picked up on them this week was literally just because I really wanted to try doing something in the style of Discharge and thought it would be funny to give that treatment to a song by a band in a very different style but whose name also started with Dis. So I did a bit of Googling, landed on Disclosure. I thought, don't know if I've even heard of them. But then once I looked at who they were and heard White Noise again, I was like, oh, I remember this. I think that was the only one of their songs I remembered hearing at all. So discovering that they had this expansive career beyond that was quite a revelation to me this week. It's one of the reasons why I enjoy doing this channel, to be honest. But yeah, if like me, you don't have a clue about Disclosure, they're a duo made up of two brothers, Guy and Howard Lawrence from Reigate in Surrey. When they first started releasing music around 2010, I think, made a handful of just independent singles. Stylistically quite interesting. I mean, as I've said in previous videos where I've touched on dance styles, including last week's, I'm no kind of dance music expert. I don't really know a great deal about it, and I sometimes have trouble differentiating between different subgenres. Disclosure, from what I can gather, are pretty interesting in that they've never really fully committed to one particular style of electronic dance music. They do seem to skip between a few different styles, take elements from different subgenres to just make their own particular sound. So there'll be bits of deep house, there'll be elements of two-step garage, there'll be hints of drum and bass, that kind of thing. They just kind of pick and choose sounds that they like and put them all together. Quite early on, they acquired a contract with a management company. I think that's when they really started to take off, because the management company had quite a few high-profile vocalists also on its books, so they started pairing different guest singers with Disclosure, and that's when they started to gather a lot more attention. So as I say, the first song that I remember hearing was White Noise, the song I picked this week, which is a collaboration with Aluna George. That's another electronic music duo with Aluna Francis and George Reed. It's Aluna's voice that you hear on the track. That was the first thing I heard, but I gather around the same time they also had collaborations with Sam Smith, who I guess must have just been really sort of starting to get a bit of a buzz around them at that time. Eliza Doolittle and various others. And that's kind of the model they've continued with for quite some time after that, with, the guests getting bigger and bigger the more their own success grew. So you get people like The Weeknd guesting on later records, that kind of stuff. And I was completely unaware any of this was going on, because I'm just totally not tuned into what's happening in electronic music. But they do really appear to have become one of the UK's most celebrated electronic music acts. They've been nominated for Grammy Awards several times. They've been headlining massive shows. And if that initial run of hit singles dried up fairly soon, it doesn't seem to have hurt them overall as an act. They've continued to be critically acclaimed. They've held on to an audience and seem to be properly accepted as artists rather than pop hit makers. And from the bit that I heard of their most recent album, I think Alchemy, it seems like they're consciously developing away from that sort of more commercial side of things that maybe they were encouraged to lean into earlier in their career. So they're now on a smaller indie label, and it's the first album that is just the duo, no outside vocalists, no high profile collabs. It's just, I think it's Howard of the pair who is mainly the songwriter and who handles the vocals when they do in-house vocals, and then Guy, who's the one responsible for coming up with the beats. That's kind of how I gather it works. And I had a little listen to the album. I'm certainly no expert on these things, but it sounds pretty cool to me. Still plenty danceable, but it's got some real depth to it as well. More sonic variety than I think you sometimes hear in dance music records as well. And yeah, as a non-aficionado of any kind of electronic dance music style, I've found it a pretty satisfying listen, I must admit. So I doubt I'll become some kind of hardcore fan, but it's always a pleasure to just discover music that I didn't really know was being created and to just broaden my perspective a little bit. So I'm really glad of that this week. As I say, from what I can gather across their work, Disclosure have pulled from a variety of different styles. One style that, as far as I'm aware, they've never pulled from is D-Beat. Now, D-Beat's something I've felt like I'd like to have a proper go at on this channel for a little while. When I did my UK82 version of Firestarter by The Prodigy, that ended up coming out a little bit more D-Beat than strictly UK82. There's definitely like a pretty massive grey area between those two particular styles of punk, and they both share that spiky abrasiveness and that barreling, Motorhead-ish rhythmic momentum. But I think what sets D-Beat apart as a style is this stark minimalism, the sense of utter bleakness, and also the musical harshness that removes it a step from more traditional kind of rock and roll sounding punk. I think Discharge, who were the creators and innovators of D-Beat, set themselves apart from a bunch of their early 80s contemporaries in a few ways. Although they certainly would have had common influences, a lot of their contemporaries like GBH and The Exploited still definitely had links back to the more kind of street level punk rock style of the previous generation of groups, the likes of the UK Subs, Sham 69, and through them back into sort of pub rock. So there's still a bit of a more traditional rock and roll element in their sound. Whereas in Discharge, there's none of that. They'll very rarely play any kind of guitar riff that sounds like it could be traced back through some lineage to Chuck Berry. If anything, the closest antecedent you can find for them would be something like Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath, that sort of harsh discord. In terms of actual songs as well, those other early 80s UK bands, although they're doing stuff that's pretty stripped down and to the point, they're generally still fairly conventionally constructed songs. Verses made up of 4 or 8 lines, whereas Discharge just strip all that right down. Quite often song lyrics read more like a haiku than an actual song. Very simple, stark phrases, quite often just a slogan or a descriptive phrase describing some horrific nuclear scenario, everything pared down to the bare minimum for maximum impact. And I'd say also as a third thing, while sort of UK82 contemporaries like The Exploited and GBH could be considered to be, to some levels, as I say, street punk, which bleeds on one side into Oi, the kind of skinhead punk movement, I'd say, if anything, Discharge have one foot more in the anarcho-punk camp of Crass and their contemporaries. Definitely a stronger, starker political message to their work than that of a lot of those other street-level kind of UK proto-hardcore bands. Since we're talking about the genre that's called D-Beat, I should also talk a little bit about the actual D-Beat itself, the signature rhythm that drives a lot of Discharge songs that the genre's named after. Although Discharge definitely popularised it, certainly wasn't the first time that rhythm had been used, and there are different theories about who used the very first one. I think it's a Belgian band, kind of like a Belgian sort of proto-thrash oddity from the early 70s. I can't remember their name, but they get brought up quite often whenever anyone discusses this. And you can hear, okay, this does sound a little bit like a sort of prototype of something that Discharge were doing. Almost zero chance that Discharge actually heard that or been influenced by it. A more likely actual influence for Discharge using that beat would be the Buzzcocks, who on the song You Tear Me Up have a beat that's very much that early the Discharge sound, slightly lopsided high-speed gallop that is really kind of characteristic of that whole genre. But Discharge took that beat and absolutely made it their own, paired it with this just wall of distortion and guttural bass and chainsaw guitars and these barked vocals, and the impact of that sound was almost immediate, really. You get bands just taking that template and running with it, springing up all over the world. And Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, there's a whole amazing movement of these bands, which is very influential in its own right. In Japan as well, and in the States. And it's not just the punks who were influenced by this either, also had a pretty immediate influence on the more extreme end of heavy metal. Just that sense of apocalyptic darkness and, as I say, that sort of Sabbathy, demonic sounding discordance really appealed to a bunch of metal bands. So I think it's fair to say there's pretty much no early thrash band or early black metal band that doesn't have a very significant Discharge influence in there. You know, Celtic Frost, Sepultura, Bathory, Venom, all of these bands owe a fairly significant chunk of their existence to what those lads from Stoke were doing. Now, Discharge themselves, having created this iconic sound fairly naturally, I guess, then wanted to evolve. Like with a lot of other early 80s punk bands, as they got more accomplished, a bit better at their instruments, a bit more sophisticated in terms of songwriting, I started to find the genre a bit confining. So I started to try and develop a little bit away from that initial sound, which led to, I think, 1986's Grave New World album, which lives on in its infamy with many a punk. There's still some punky elements in there, but it's largely a metal album. I think combining their own sound with metal seems like a pretty obvious direction for Discharge to go in, and could have worked really well. And there's a whole genre spawning in Japan around the same time, like the Burning Spirits genre, which basically combined Discharge style hardcore with metal to great effect. I think the issue with Discharge was that they just dived a little too far into metal and abandoned their roots a little too much. Cal, the singer, particularly completely abandoned his previous vocal delivery for this sort of weird Americanized yowl, which is very uncomfortable to listen to. And there's a pretty famous bootleg recording of them playing in, I think, LA around that time, coming out with this new style to a room full of people who were still expecting to hear the classic Discharge sound and being kind of pretty much booed off stage. So Discharge vanished into metal for a little while there, which wasn't a particularly welcome development for either punk fans or metal fans, but by that time their influence had already spread so far that there were literally thousands of bands carrying on their legacy in different ways, some of whom had developed the sound and combined it with other things to create the crust punk subgenre. You get grindcore developing, bands like Napalm Death, but Extreme Noise Terror particularly, their early stuff is basically just sped up D-beat. And then bands who, rather than trying to combine or develop the sounds, just stuck right to the original template. Some of whom even went so far as to give their bands names that began with Dis to signal their kinship with Discharge, which I guess is what inspired this week's entire video. Bands like Disgust, Dysphere, some really funny ones like Disploited. So yeah, they really spawned a whole world of different punk and metal subgenres, and that sound has just kept going, kept developing. It continues to be hugely influential and hugely important, and you'd think that something so minimal and so simple would lose its appeal and would lose its interest, but I don't know, maybe for some people it would. But I got hooked on this stuff when I was like 14 years old, and in the run-up to doing this I put on Why and Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing again for the first time in a little while, and it still hits just as hard as it ever did. I immediately felt like that same kind of excitable 14-year-old again. Yeah, just awesome. But yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, we're going back to early 2013 in our alternative universe. Disclosure have been releasing independent singles for a little while. They've started to gain some real critical commercial momentum. They're doing very well. It feels like they're on the cusp of like a big commercial breakthrough, and their schedule scheduled to go into the studio to record their next single, White Noise, with Aluna George. The night before their recording session is scheduled, they think, well, just take it easy tonight. We'll pop down to our local pub, just have a couple of quiet drinks, just wander around to their local where they're well known by everyone. There's a DJ on in the pub that night. He's billed as a DJ. What he's actually doing is just playing tracks off his iPod, but such is life. This alleged DJ sees the Lawrence brothers walking in, immediately recognises them as the sort of local heroes, and he thinks, to welcome them in, I'll put their song on, that'll be fun, won't it? We'll celebrate the local boys by playing their music. So he's scrolling away on his iPod. Unfortunately, he's a bit too eager on the little click wheel, and instead of selecting Disclosure, accidentally selects the artist before them in alphabetical order, which, because he was an old punk before he got into dance music, happens to be Discharge. So instead of giving everyone a blast of Disclosure's latest single, he gives them all an absolutely deafening burst of Protest and Survive by Discharge instead. Now, the Lawrence brothers have never heard Discharge before, but they're immediately just stunned by this powerful, bleak noise that they're hearing. It's quite unlike anything that they've experienced before, and they have to go and ask the DJ, what is this music that you're playing to us? And they're so taken with this that they decide, actually, this is the direction they've got to follow from this point onwards. So Aluna Francis turns up for the recording session the next day. She's surprised to find that they've completely abandoned all their electronic gear, and instead of synths and sequencers and drum machines, she's being accompanied by crudely played, loud, raw guitar, bass and drums. But she does her best, and they make the record. And although their shocking new direction completely sinks their career in dance music, they're embraced by the punk underground and continue to lead a happy life on the anarcho circuit, playing the punks, picnics and squats of Europe. So, in attempting to transform White Noise into a D-Beat track, first step as ever was just getting the isolated vocal, dropping into GarageBand, syncing up to the grid. I couldn't find a nice clean studio acapella of it, so it's a messy stem splitter track, lots of horrible background noise on it. Luckily, I was putting a noisy accompaniment to it, so it covers up at least a bit of that. Once it was synced up, I realised it has far too many lyrics and it's far too complex for a D-Beat song, so cut out about 90% of the song. I think all that I've left is a bit of the pre-chorus and then one line of the chorus, which I just repeat around a couple of times. So there's almost none of the song left, but there is just a bit. Next thing was putting some drums on there. Wanted it to sound very human and as sort of raw and rough as possible, so played it in manually on the MIDI keyboard rather than programming it. Didn't quantize anything at all, it's just how it was played in without too much care and concern for timing. Simple D beats, really simple snare fills, blasting away on the crash cymbal, no subtlety whatsoever. Added some bass next, raw, horrible, disgusting, distorted bass tone, growling away underneath there, pretty much just doubling what the guitar's doing. And then guitar-wise, I've got 3 guitars on there. A pair of rhythm guitars, which are panned hard left and right. Went for a proper nasty kind of push amp with a sort of 70s distortion pedal cranked sound. Not too much low end or low mids, a lot of fairly harsh treble as well. Concocted a couple of very basic, very filthy riffs that just hammer out for the 2 sections. And then I'd left room for just a little instrumental break. I just wanted something ugly and attitudinal, so the little solo is essentially just me grabbing handfuls of strings and knocking the shit out of them, which came out sounding pretty much how I wanted it to. And that was it, basically. It was a pretty simple one. Pushed everything as hard as I could, so everything's overdriving a little bit without completely turning to mush. And it was all done in 1 minute and 35 seconds. And then for the video, as ever, started out by just trying to find some footage of Disclosure with Aluna performing the song back in the day. Guy and Howard don't really appear in it very much, just because you can't really make them look that much like a punk band when they're just standing behind walls of computers and synths. But they pop up in the background occasionally. I'm mainly just trying to edit it down to keep the focus on Aluna since she's there delivering the lead vocal. Then I needed to make it look like a punk show, so wanted some authentic D-Beat musicians in there. Found some great footage of the Verucas playing at a very different festival. So just edited them in for some guitar, bass and drums, and there's loads of great crowd footage as well, people stage diving, complete chaos, so that just kind of completed the picture nicely, I thought. And then for a final touch, thought I'd just try and take the Disclosure logo and insert them on a few suitably crusty looking bills to try and show that they're part of that scene, so most of a few gig posters, just to provide that little finishing touch there. So I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, it was a pretty flimsy premise, just taking a band whose name begins with Dis and turning them into a Discharge style band, but I had loads of fun with it. It's a style I wanted to try making for a little while, and I think it came out pretty rocking. Let me know what you think down in the comments anyway, and if you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe. The algorithm's really battering it at the moment, so any assistance really helps. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. Your suggestions are always welcome. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.